afternoon. I'm Sharon Van Sickle Robbins, City Club President, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, October 22nd for today's forum. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and TV audiences, would everyone in the room please make sure your cell phones are silenced. Today we will hear from two candidates for U.S. Senate, Democratic incumbent Ron Wyden and his Republican opponent Jim Huffman. But first, some announcements. I'd like to start by recognizing our new City Club members, or if you're with us at a Friday forum for the first time in a long time, could you please stand and let us welcome you? Ooh. Welcome. In addition to thanking our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, we would also like to offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors. Their generous financial support makes these City Club luncheons possible. We're especially pleased to have with us today representatives from AARP Oregon and Baron Liebman. If our sponsor tables could please rise, I'd like to invite the rest of the crowd to join me in offering our sincere appreciation to them and to our other fall season sponsored, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and PGE. If your company or firm would like to be a City Club sponsor, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club offices. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's debate. Jeff Gianola has been reporting and anchoring in Portland for 28 years. He began his local career at television station KATU before moving to KOIN 6 in 1998. For many years, Jeff has featured foster children in need of adoption on his Wednesday's Child segments. Jeff and his wife Shannon also started the Wednesday's Child Foundation, helping foster children experience life-enriching opportunities such as summer camp. We're pleased to have him with us today. Jeff?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege to be here for something rare, an actual political debate during this political season. And our candidates and you are to be commended for that. It's my privilege to moderate this U.S. Senate candidate debate between Jim Huffman and Senator Ron Wyden. This debate will have several sections. First, each debater will give a 3-minute opening statement. Following the opening statements, debaters will respond to questions written in advance of this meeting by the City Club's Friday Forum Committee and the City Club staff. These are the only questions that will be asked today. There will be no questions from the floor. We will rely on the judgment of our distinguished panel of City Club members seated at the table in front of me to decide whether or not the debaters have indeed answered the questions. If 2 or more of these members raise their cards to indicate that they did not answer the question, I will re-ask the question. I'll restate it. Our panel, Brianne Arnold, Jean Hart, and Joyce Damanen. Keeping time at our table today, my fellow Italian, Tony Iaccarino. Following the City Club's questions, each debater will have the opportunity to ask either 2 or 3 questions, time permitting. The debaters will then make their 3-minute closing statements. Please be respectful of the debaters like you always are, and hold your applause during the debate. And now let me make our introductions. I'd first like to introduce Jim Huffman. Mr. Huffman earned his master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and his law degree from the University of Chicago Law School. Mr. Huffman has been a professor at Lewis and Clark Law School since 1973. He became dean of the law school in 1993, a position he held until 2006. Mr. Huffman is a member and former chair of the Executive Committee of the Environment and Property Rights Practice Group of the Federalist Society. He is the author of more than 100 articles and chapters on a wide array of legal topics, and we're glad to have him with us today. The City Club also pleased to welcome U.S. Senator Ron Wyden. He earned his law degree from the University of Oregon Law School in 1974, after which he taught gerontology and co-founded the Oregon chapter of the Gray Panthers, an advocacy group for the elderly. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1981 until his election to the U.S. Senate in 1996, where he has served for the past 14 years. He sits on the committees on Finance, Intelligence, Budget, and Aging. He is also on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where he serves on subcommittees on energy, water, and power, and chairs the subcommittees on forests and public land. As I step down to the moderator's table to begin our questions, let's give our candidates a round warm of applause there. We will start with our opening statements. Mr. Huffman, you will go first. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Never in our lifetime have we more desperately needed true leadership, trust, courage, and common sense in our elected officials. We need immediate action that will give Oregonians the confidence to invest in job creation and economic prosperity. We need a long-term plan for achieving sustained prosperity in America, and we must stop the reckless spending that is burdening our children and grandchildren with unconscionable debt. I am running for the Senate because I can no longer sit back and do nothing. We trusted that Ron Wyden would exercise courage and seek solutions that would help us. He didn't, and he won't. For 30 years, Ron Wyden has represented Oregon in Congress. It is no coincidence that during the 14 years he served in the Senate, unemployment in Oregon has exceeded the national average. And it is no coincidence that our economy has suffered in every sector of this state. He promised us one thing, as with the health care bill, and did another. Ron Wyden will remind you today that he has visited every county every year. He will remind you of particular businesses that he has helped. I commend him for these things. But these are the basics every senator or congressman should provide. These are the bare minimum, what Ben Bulletin calls the small things. On what Ben Bulletin calls the big stuff, health care, spending, debt, you name it, Ron Wyden has been either wrong or missing in action. The Oregonian sings his praises for bipartisanship, but what has he actually accomplished? By his own account, timber payments that passed by unanimous consent in 2000, 75 to 22 in 2007, and he voted against them in 2008. Nanotechnology legislation has passed by unanimous consent. Internet tax freedom legislation that passed in 1998, 96 to 2, and in 2004, 93 to 3, and in 2007, again by unanimous consent. An East Side Forest Plan that is in its current form is not supported by the American Forest Resources Council, does not have the support of everyone in industry or the environmental community, does not have the support of the committee chair in the Senate, and does not have the support of Oregon's East Side congressman. Hardly a record of legislative leadership, and on the big stuff, health care, tax reform, his proposals have gone nowhere. My wife, Leslie, and I are committed to doing everything we can to assure that our kids and yours will have the opportunity to find jobs and live prosperous and happy lives in Oregon. Unlike Mr. Wyden, I don't seek a career in politics. I will go to Washington to make a difference and not make a living. I will draw on a lifetime of working with people of different perspectives to bring real bipartisanship to the United States Senate. 30 years is enough. We can't afford more. It's time for new leadership in Oregon, for Oregon and Washington. Thank you.
Senator Wyden, your opening remarks.
Jeff, thank you very much, and thank you to all City Club members for this great tradition. It is good to be back with all of you. Last night, we debated in Medford. That was my 41st visit to the Rogue Valley this term. As you may know, I've held over 550 open town hall meetings across our state, and I'm absolutely certain I'm not going to get any softball questions this afternoon. Now, everybody knows these are some of the toughest times that Oregon has ever endured. People are worried about their job, their house, and getting their kids through college. That's why I focus on solving problems, not playing political games. I don't care if you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. We are all part of Oregon, and everybody here wants to make our state a better place. and that certainly includes Jim Huffman, even though you're going to hear this afternoon there are plenty of areas we disagree on. As for me, I got my start in politics a little different than most. I saw senior citizens weren't getting the care and respect they deserve, so I created a free legal clinic to protect seniors from insurance ripoffs and phone scams. I've never forgotten my mission working with older people to make sure that every person receives the respect and dignity they deserve. Today, too many in Washington are focused on what matters to Wall Street, the military contractors, the big oil companies, instead of focusing on solving problems for you and your family. I believe there's a different way, an Oregon way, that builds on what we have in common and recognizes that no one political party has all the right answers. And that's why I'm proud of the fact that I have a Republican and a Democratic co-chair for this campaign in each of Oregon's 36 counties. And I believe my focus on bipartisanship is the major reason why 15 out of 17 Oregon newspapers have endorsed my reelection. It's the way I'm focusing to fix our job-killing tax system, my focus on ending Pentagon boondoggles and bringing down the debt, my push to make Oregon #1 in clean energy jobs and to cut our dependence on foreign oil, and the fact that for the first time I brought together timber companies and conservationists to restore Oregon's forests and put our people back to work. I have never forgotten what I learned working with the elderly. Stand up for people, fight for what's right. Thank you again to the City Club for this great tradition and this debate.
We will now move to the portion of the program where I will ask the questions prepared by the Friday Forum Committee and by City Club staff. The debaters have not seen these questions in advance. I will direct all questions in this debate to both debaters, each of whom will have 60 seconds to respond, and we encourage our debaters to use their time not only to offer their response, but also to rebut their opponent's statement. You have 60 seconds for that as well. Our first question will be to Mr. Huffman. This is a two-part question. Since the recession began, Americans have suffered devastating job losses. As of August, Oregon has the 5th highest unemployment rate in the nation, with more than 10% of the labor force unemployed. This is almost a 1.5 higher than the national rate. Why is unemployment in Oregon so high compared to most states? And what, if anything, can a U.S. Senator do to help Oregon generate more jobs?
Thank you. Unemployment in this state is not only higher than the national average, it's been so for the 14 years that Senator Wyden served in Congress. For 21 consecutive months, it's been in excess of 10%. I think the reason is because we have uncertainty in our business community. We have uncertainty resulting from the fact that Congress has failed to take action on the extension of the current tax rates, and Congress has imposed new and burdensome regulations through the health care bill and the financial regulation bill. The other reason that the state of Oregon has higher unemployment is because we have devastated the rural communities of this state by basically shutting down the timber industry. And Senator Wyden has voted for every single measure that has led to the virtual impossibility of harvesting timber in this state. And if we could get those industries back on their feet, I think we'd have unemployment that was below the national average, not above. Thank you.
Senator Wyden, your response.
Jeff, I feel that our state...
Hold it. Our committee has held up the question. They want you to answer that question, Mr. Huffman, to boil down your answer a little bit. You have a little more time, 45 seconds.
Maybe you could repeat the question, because I thought I had answered it. It's Mr. Huffman, by the way.
Why is unemployment in Oregon so high compared to most states, Mr. Huffman? And what, if anything, can a U.S. Senator do to help Oregon generate more jobs?
It's higher because of the reasons I've stated. The reason what a U.S. Senator can do is, first of all, on the timber issues, do real change to the federal policies that limit the harvesting of timber in the state, extend the current tax rates into the coming year, and bring more regulatory certainty into people's lives. That's what a United States Senator can do.
Senator Wyden, your response.
Jeff, I believe our state has been slow to diversify our economy but now we're making up ground. For example, the Pew Charitable Trust indicates per capita we are the green energy capital of the world. In fact, what's just come online at Shepherd's Flat in Eastern Oregon is going to produce thousands of good-paying jobs for our people in the years ahead, 845 megawatts of power, the equivalent of a nuclear power plant. So clearly, green energy, fixing the tax system, particularly so that we provide a middle-class tax cut for working folks, help for our small businesses, and then the effort to bring together the timber industry and environmental folks on forestry. That's a path to a strong Oregon economy in the future. The tax system, green energy, particularly forestry.
Our next question, we begin with Senator Wyden. Over the last few years, over $2 billion in renewable energy projects have been invested in Oregon. This has created hundreds of jobs, generated millions in revenue, and helped position our state as a green energy leader. But Oregon's efforts pale when compared with China, who last year spent over $34 billion on green energy investment, double that of the United States, and is now the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels and wind turbines. As Senator, what, if anything, would you do to keep our local and national green energy markets globally competitive?
The first thing I'm doing, Jeff, I'm chairman of the Trade Subcommittee of the Senate Finance Committee, is trying to make sure that we fight back when China engages in unfair trade practices. And they are clearly doing that in green energy. We are investigating right now the subsidies, the low-interest loans that they've provided, and I put together an effort with 43 senators that has led the Obama administration to pursue a 301 trade action against the Chinese. We enjoy in Oregon a favorable trade relationship with China. We want to continue it, but when China exploits our people and our industries, and they have done it in green energy, we have to protect Oregon workers. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm pleased that the Obama administration is pursuing what I and 43 other senators have asked them to go after, and that is fair treatment for our green energy industries. Not far from here, you can see what the stakes are for companies like Solar World that I've helped with credits.
Mr. Huffman, your response.
I would certainly be a great supporter of free trade. It has to be fair trade, but free trade. And the current administration and Democratic Congress have failed to ratify some free trade agreements that they should ratify. With respect to green energy specifically, I think it's very important for the future of this state, but I caution that it is not a be-all and end-all for this state. We will not revive the economy in this state if we put all of our eggs in the green energy basket. There's many other things we have to do. But with respect to green energy, I think we should support it, we should subsidize it, but we should not subsidize it beyond reason, because at the end of the day, subsidizing green energy raises costs for ordinary folks and for business, drives up the costs, and results in more unemployment. So I think we need to do a great deal to advance green energy, but I also think we need to proceed with some caution. If one drives up the gorge these days, it looks a lot different than it did a few years ago.
Mr. Huffman, we begin with you on our next question. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that unless we can change our current course, the federal public debt may rise to as high as 180% of the gross domestic product by 2035. Such debt would constitute a fiscal crisis of epic proportions, leading to lower investor confidence and a sharp rise in interest rates. To restore investor confidence, policymakers would likely need to enact spending cuts or tax increases more drastic and painful than those that would have been necessary had the adjustments come a little sooner. What one area of the budget would you change, and how, in order to most dramatically decrease our long-term debt?
Well, we do have a horrific debt problem in this country, which has risen dramatically over the last 14 years, and it will be at $24 trillion if we allow it to continue. I could suggest to you some things that I might propose to cut, but I don't think that goes to the point. I think the point is that we need to put Congress in the position of having to establish priorities. And I believe the only way we're going to do that is with a balanced budget amendment. We have 90 years since the New Deal of evidence that Congress is unwilling to restrain spending. And the only way we're going to restrain spending is with a constitutional balanced budget amendment, which will then force Congress to establish priorities. I have no doubt there's waste across the federal government, but I think to stand up here and suggest where I would make specific cuts is unrealistic and not the best approach. I think we need to get constraints on Congress so that they then have to, and I would love to be part of that effort, decide where to spend the money.
Oh, they would like you to answer the question again. What one area of the budget would you change?
I would not spend $2 million on exotic ants research.
Senator Wyden, your response.
The first thing I'd say is we shouldn't have any more Wall Street bailouts. We had this one that the taxpayers are still on the hook, according to the latest report, for $180 billion. So it's important that people understand the size of these sums. Also, I voted this year for a bipartisan proposal on spending to keep the entitlement programs in check. The Conrad Gregg Amendment would use a military-based closing approach to have automatic cuts voted on the floor of the United States Senate. It got hit by the left and the right, so it didn't have the votes. On this question of ants, Mr. Huffman has said that I voted for federal funding on ants. The fact checkers looked at this, and the Oregonian moved the entire needle over to false. It is the only commercial that either one of us have run in this campaign that's been designated by the fact checkers as completely false. I did not vote to fund anything that mentioned ants in the bill.
Our next question, we begin with Senator Wyden. The tax cuts implemented by Congress during the Bush administration are due to expire at the end of this year. Some argue that, in light of the economy and huge deficit, letting them expire is the wisest course. Others argue that ending the tax cuts would impose a heavy burden on American taxpayers and would stifle economic growth. The U.S. Treasury estimates that ending all tax cuts would provide $3.7 trillion in revenue over 10 years, or $700 billion in the same time span if the cuts end only for the high-income earners. Do you think the tax cuts should expire or be extended, and for whom?
Both the Obama approach and the Bush administration approach tether us to a broken tax system, driven by loopholes that I would characterize as a job killer. What we need is a bipartisan approach that's going to grow the economy. And I don't quote the Heritage Foundation every single day, but Jim's former employer there said that my bill would increase the economy by 2 million new jobs. That's 2 million new jobs per year. So I am willing, Jeff, to go along with some sort of short-term extension that would protect the middle class. I'm willing to give incentives for business and others, but it shouldn't be longer than a year or 18 months, because then we need to use that period as a bridge to real reform. And by the way, if you want to see growth, look at the 80s when Democrats and Ronald Reagan worked together. I'm another tall Democrat on the Finance Committee like Bill Bradley who wants to do it again.
Mr. Huffman, your response.
Well, every time I've been with Ron, he's mentioned my former employer, the Heritage Foundation. So I assume he believes that has some traction. I'm not sure in which direction. I would support a permanent extension of all of the current tax rates pending fundamental tax reform going forward. I believe that's the most important thing we can do to revive the economy in this state in the short term. And I would ask Senator Wyden, before this debate is over, to tell us whether or not in the lame duck session he will vote to extend all of those tax cuts, the tax cuts from 2001 and 2003.
Our next question, we begin with Mr. Huffman. Most acknowledge that, as currently structured, the Social Security system is not sustainable. Full Social Security funding is only assured for another 30 to 45 years, after which the program could only fund a decreasing portion of the currently promised benefits. How specifically would you tackle the increasing long-term liabilities in the Social Security system?
I think we need to tackle them along with all the other entitlement programs that the federal government now has. If you add up all of the liabilities of governments in this country, federal, state, and local, on top of the federal deficit, you get about $120 trillion of liabilities. That amounts to about 10 years of gross domestic product. We've clearly got a problem. With respect to Social Security specifically, I don't want to preempt Senator Wyden's claim that I propose to privatize Social Security. I do not. What I have proposed and do support is allowing new entrants into the system to opt for private accounts for at least a portion of what they put into the Social Security system. I believe that's what most Americans believed they were doing all along, contrary to what actually happens with the Social Security system. I will also support raising the age for new entrants for retirement and adjusting the rate of increase of benefits for new entrants. But I would protect existing benefits for all now on and soon to be on Social Security.
Senator Wyden, your response.
Jeff, I would use the model that worked once before, and that was in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan, Alan Greenspan, Tip O'Neill put together a bipartisan advisory group, and they made the tough calls. Suffice it to say, these are issues that you can see someone try to get a partisan advantage on if you just go a partisan route. But they came together, they did it in a bipartisan way. I want to use that model once again. On the privatization question, again, my opponent is rewriting history. Steve Forbes came out this summer. It was his big national speaker, and Steve Forbes, you can see it on tape, said that the big reason he was for Jim Huffman is because he wanted to privatize Social Security. Now, the other point that I would make on this issue is I think we do need more private saving on top of Social Security. I would encourage employers and employees to come together to find incentives for automatic enrollment in private retirement systems.
Our next question, there's no rebuttal. I'm going to ask you each a question, then a slightly different question to the other candidate. And Senator Wyden, we begin with you.
My notes are always disappearing, too.
Here it is. If Republicans regain control of either or both the House and Senate, they have pledged to repeal or roll back the health care reform bill that Congress passed. Senator Wyden, you've been a leader in the Senate on health care and are a member of the Senate Finance Committee involved in the final bill. What modifications, if any, would you support?
Jeff, first of all, if you just repeal it, you go back to the days when the insurance companies can discriminate against somebody with a pre-existing condition, when they can just rescind a policy, just arbitrarily cancel it. In our state, where we have a very high cancer rate, you could also have big co-payments for preventive services. That'd be a mistake. The big thing that I want to see done, Jeff, that will create more choice and competition is to use a provision that is in the final law. It is really copied after my bipartisan bill that would allow Oregon and any other innovative state to go out and get a waiver and create its own approach. This could be bipartisan. Republicans like John DeLorenzen have been strong supporters of this in our state as well. We could create a bigger marketplace, put us in a position to get more choice and competition, hold the insurance companies accountable. I think that approach will have bipartisan support in January of 2011.
Mr. Huffman, do you support a full repeal of the plan, and if so, why? Or do you support modifications to the plan, and if so, what would they be?
I do support a full repeal because I think we need to start over and solve the problem which Senator Wyden mentioned that we have. The problem in health care is that costs are too high. The solution to that, as he said, is competition and choice. He voted for a bill, he was the 60th vote for a bill that brought no competition and no choice to the medical profession or to health insurance. So what we need to do is do what he proposed we do before, and that is modify the third-party insurance system that gives consumers of health care no incentives to consume wisely. Secondly, we need to have interstate competition in health care insurance. Thirdly, we need to make the policies transportable from one employer to the next. And fourthly, and not one of the positions that he advocates, we need some tort reform to reduce the cost of defensive medicine practice and the cost of liability insurance on pharmaceutical companies. If we do those things, We will have choice and competition, and I think the only way to do that is to start over and get it right from the beginning.
Our next question, and we do go back to the response format. Mr. Huffman, we begin with you. Both the Bush and Obama administrations have been criticized for not developing and gaining passage of some sort of immigration reform legislation. Many states are now taking matters into their own hands in attempts to resolve or at least influence this difficult and complex issue. What specific immigration reform policies, if any, do you support?
I support, first of all, the United States government starting to enforce the laws that we have, which means securing the borders. We'll never have a 100% secure borders, but we can do much better than we're doing now. Secondly, I support a guest worker program that works. I've talked to numerous employers, particularly agricultural employers in this state, who depend upon immigrant labor but are unable to use a guest worker program because it's too costly. There's no reason it needs to be costly. It should be more efficient and less costly for employers so they can use it and so that their businesses can prosper. And thirdly, I support the extension of the current policies with respect to employment. The Department of Commerce has implemented an e-verify system that allows employers to determine whether or not employees are legally here. We need to expand that system and make it effective so that people who will come here only legally to get employment. If they can't get employment, they will not come.
Senator Wyden, your response.
Jeff, I've repeatedly voted to support more efforts on the border with agents, with surveillance systems. That is critical for our nation's sovereignty. Second, I've supported directing all the federal agencies to enforce the laws on the books. This is a fundamental question of whether we respect the rule of law, and I do deeply. Third, employers who knowingly hire people who are here illegally should face sanctions. And there's an e-verify system, so there's a good tool for employers to know how to proceed. Finally, on the toughest question, if all of those steps were put in place, I would say, as George W. Bush and the late Ted Kennedy said in a bipartisan way, that people who come forward voluntarily, who've been here illegally, pay a fine, show that they have mastered English, show that they have not broken any other laws. I believe they ought to be given the opportunity to go to the end of the citizenship line. That is what George W. Bush was for and Ted Kennedy.
Our next question, we begin with you, Senator Wyden. Oregon's rural counties long relied on sales of timber on federal lands to fund public services. When Clinton administration policy set some new limits on logging, Congress chose to compensate these communities for lost revenue. These federal payments, worth more than $230 million, are due to expire shortly. If these payments are not extended, what would you do for these timber-dependent rural communities?
Jeff, I'm going to get those payments extended. I was the one who wrote the original law that made them possible for our state. I consider it the most important law that I have written for our state. It brought our state over $2.5 billion in the last decade. And folks, if we had not had that law, we would have had 10,000 people laid off in the middle of a recession. So I'm going to get it reauthorized. Bill Clinton didn't want to sign it. George W. Bush didn't want to sign it. But I was able to build a bipartisan coalition to get it passed. The Association of Oregon Counties has singled me out repeatedly for my work in this area. I will also say this is a historic obligation because it began 100 years ago when the federal forest system was created, but we also need to have new industries, and that's why I'm championing biomass, the idea of getting wood waste as a new energy source, and I have been opposing the Obama administration approach at EPA that would treat biomass like it was a fossil fuel.
They would like you to re-answer the question, Senator. If these payments are not extended, what would you do for these timber-dependent rural communities?
I would pursue other important industries like biomass, where I'm leading the fight with my East Side Forest bill. But I want everybody to know that having written the law, having written the reauthorization, I'm going to get them renewed.
Mr. Huffman, your response.
I would do everything I could to revive the timber industry in this state. It's been devastated over the last 20 years. We've gone from 8 billion board feet of harvesting in this state to under 800 million board feet. That's a tenth. Imagine what that does to communities that depend upon the family wage jobs that came with these timber mills. I think the way we get there is not the way that Senator Wyden has proposed through the East Side Forest Plan. At best, that plan, if enacted, which is unlikely, and if funded, which is more unlikely, we would get is perhaps the preservation of the existing mills on that side of the divide, which number only 8 today. The counties in this state are not looking for handouts from the federal government. They're looking to have viable economies and a tax base that allows them to support their county services and their schools, and the only way we're going to do that is to revive the rural economy of this state, and that depends on putting the resources back to work, and we can do that while protecting the environment.
Our next question, we begin with Mr. Huffman. The number of filibusters in the Senate has hit record levels, traditionally used to ensure that the majority does not run roughshod over the rights and interests of the minority party. Many argue that the filibuster is now merely promoting gridlock. Do you believe the filibuster has outlived its purpose? And if so, what changes to current Senate rules would you support?
Well, I would support the elimination of the rules, the repeal of the rules that allow for the filibuster. There was nowhere in the United States Constitution, which I've taught to a few thousand law students over the last 37 years, that says that there should be a supermajority to pass anything in the United States Senate. And I think it is the biggest obstacle to bipartisanship in this country, and I would strongly support the repeal of the rules that allow for a filibuster in the United States Senate.
Senator Wyden, your response.
I certainly would support changes as well. I will say that if you get rid of it altogether, Oregon wouldn't have our death with dignity law because the House of Representatives voted to get rid of it. It was one of the few instances where I felt it was important to go to the floor alone and protect our state. The big change that's needed here is to prevent anybody from blocking a bill or a nomination, which is really the key procedural tool in the United States Senate, in secret. And Chuck Grassley and I, he's the Republican senator from Iowa, have led this fight. And folks, the Senate would already be required to do public business in public if it wasn't for Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina, who is the senator that Jim Huffman says and has said repeatedly he would emulate if he came to the United States Senate. It's time to ensure that the public's business is done in public.
This is our last question before you get the opportunity to question each other, and we begin with Senator Wyden. For 17 years, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy has prohibited those who are openly gay and lesbian from serving in the military. Since its inception, this policy has been fought in Congress and in the courts. On Tuesday, a California judge issued an injunction on enforcement of this hotly debated policy. Americans now await word regarding whether the Department of Justice will appeal the ruling or let it stand. Do you support the ability of openly gay and lesbian troops to serve in the U.S. military? Why or why not?
I am a very strong opponent of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell legislation, and I believe anybody who wants to fight for our great country and protect our national security interests, who meets the qualifications that are necessary for that position, should not be discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation. I serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Can't get into anything classified, but I can tell you we are losing out on talented people, particularly in areas like Arabic languages and positions we need to protect our national security because of this outdated rule. I believe, Jeff, the Justice Department should not appeal that California decision, that the Obama administration should move immediately to end the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that is detrimental to America's national security and violative of the principles that our country is all about, which is if you have the skills and the talents, there shouldn't be anything that you're barred from.
Mr. Huffman, your response.
Well, I'm a firm believer in the equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment of this Constitution. And so I favor allowing every American to serve in every possible capacity serving the interests of their nation. The only question I would raise is whether or not the administration or the courts ought to let, or Congress ought to let the military review of that policy run its course that it was set to do before a final decision is taken. It seems to me to have set up a process and then circumvent it is not good public policy. But at the end of the day, I am a full supporter of equal opportunity for everybody in this country without regard to race, religion, gender, or sexual orientation.
We're going to change gears here. This is where you each get to question each other, and we have time for 3 questions. During this portion of the program, each debater will ask questions of the other. We have time for 3 questions from each debater. Debaters must ask their question in 30 seconds. The opposing debater will have 1 minute to respond, after which the questioner will have the option of a 30-second rebuttal. We will alternate between the debaters, and we're going to begin with Senator Wyden. Senator Wyden, your first question of Mr. Huffman.
Mr. Huffman, throughout the campaign, you've attacked the East Side Forest Compromise I sponsored. After protracted negotiations, conservationists and timber mills came together for the first time on a plan to create jobs and restore 6 million acres of endangered forests. Even if you don't believe that the East Side Forest Compromise will accomplish as much as the mills think it will, why have you devoted so much of your time and energy to tearing it down? Do you really prefer the status quo of the last 20 years to this compromise between the mills and the environmental folks?
Well, I haven't devoted an enormous amount of time to tearing it down. I did write one commentary in the Oregonian explaining why I was opposed to it, and I will restate those positions. I believe that it's a compromise in which many interested parties did not participate and with which they do not agree. I know there is a mill owner in this room who does not agree with that policy, and there are environmental groups who do not agree with the proposal that you've put forward. It's a proposal that is not going to work effectively, that the science does not support. The fact that we're going to limit cutting to trees that are 21 inches or smaller has no scientific foundation for that. But the thing I most object to about it is that it's an attempt to solve a Western United States-wide problem, a Forest Service-wide problem, by a particular solution in a particular location. There's a parallel bill in Montana, as you know, and the chairman of your committee does not support it for exactly the same reason, that it is not the solution that will solve the problem across the American West.
Mr. Huffman, last night in Timber Country, you falsely announced that the state's leading timber association was withdrawing its support for the compromise. The American Forest Resources Council has now informed me that you simply made this statement up. The litigation you prefer has cost us 2 decades of gridlock and lost jobs. I know you're a law professor, but I prefer negotiation to litigation, and we've got to find a way to bring people together. We have done that.
Mr. Huffman, your first question of Senator Wyden.
In its endorsement of my candidacy, the Bend Bulletin states that you, quote, have done many of the small things well, but on the big stuff, you have been wrong too often. By the big stuff, they mean the stimulus bill, the health care bill, cap and trade. In our joint editorial board appearances, and in our debate last night, and in your commercials, you avoid any reference to the votes you have taken on the stimulus bill, the health care bill, and your position on cap and trade. Why are you unwilling to defend these policies and the impact they have on every single Oregonian?
I just outlined here on the biggest domestic issue of our time what I'm for on health care. I said I don't want to go back to the days when the insurance companies can hammer anybody who's not healthy and wealthy. I made that very clear. On the stimulus legislation, we were looking at the possibility of a depression. It's not a perfect bill, but you can go out on Highway 26 and you can see the fruits of my Build America Bonds program. Oregon issued more than $500 million worth of these bonds. We've got people working. This has been a big shot in the arm. The treasurer is saying we saved 10% on the bond issue. And by the way, Jim, when you're always attacking the whole question of these projects, I want to note that back when you were the dean of the Lewis and Clark Law School, you were asking for earmarks as well, and actually made me a special alum of the school because I delivered on a crime victims program.
Your response.
The crime victims program was a part of a broader bill sponsored under the Victims of Crime Center in the Department of Justice. Let me just say in summary that the stimulus bill, a total of about $1 trillion in the two stimulus bills, both of which you voted for, about 6% of that, $60 billion, has gone for infrastructure, and about half of that has been spent. Where did the rest of it go, and why are you not defending that?
Senator Wyden, your next question of Mr. Huffman.
Mr. Huffman, I voted against the $700 billion Wall Street bailout. You supported it. I passed a law to cut the taxpayer-funded bonuses for Wall Street executives. You defended those bonuses. I supported the financial reform bill that ended too big to fail. You opposed it. I opposed privatizing Social Security, and we heard that Steve Forbes was here because he liked the fact that you were for that position. So my question, Jim, is, don't you think Wall Street has taken enough of our money?
Ron, I have never said I would support, and I have never had the opportunity to vote on the TARP bill or any other bill. I said of the TARP bill that of a lot of legislation that was passed over the last 2 years, it was the best of a lot of bad legislation. And the reason I said it was the best, and I would say that again today, is because it was not a bailout, it was a loan program. It was investment by the federal government, investment that was going to be returned. And much of it has been returned. As you pointed out last night, not all of it has, but much of it has. So as compared to the total bailout of the stimulus bill, $1 trillion, none of which is returned to the federal government, I'd say it's you who voted for the bailout and not me who favored one by suggesting that TARP was not a perfect bill, but a lot better than most of what you voted for.
Jim, you can run from your record, but the quotes speak for themselves. The Bend Bulletin looked at where you came down on the bailout, and I quote here, "It is true that Huffman has supported the bank bailout," unquote. In a column, you wrote what was wrong with outrage over bonuses was, quote, "when it infects elected officials and they decide to take action," unquote. You bet. That's why I pushed for a bipartisan proposal to cut those taxpayer-funded bonuses. Time and time again, you stood on the side of Wall Street, and I have stood with the people of Oregon. Those are the facts.
Mr. Huffman, your question to Senator Wyden.
Senator Wyden, in defending your 2007 Healthy Americans Act, you told Dylan Ratigan on MSNBC that the keys to health care reform are competition and choice. You repeated that here today. You were critical of the other Democratic proposals and said you would not vote for a bill that needed to be fixed later. Yet you provided the 60th vote for Obamacare, which fails to bring competition and choice. And you have also said since then that you believe it needs to be fixed, including the 1099 form requirement. So how can we understand this or anything else that you've said to be to evidence where you stand on health care? Why did you vote for it?
I voted for it again because I didn't want to cling to the day when insurance companies could just hammer so many of our people. I've outlined that, and clearly this bill, while far from perfect, offers more choice and more competition with the exchanges that are going to begin in 2014 than the status quo. I do want to go further. I have been for approaches that allow for state innovation for well over a decade. Oregon has been a pioneer in this area. We did it with the elderly, taking institutional dollars and making it possible for home care. We did it with John Kitzhaber's approach, so we'd start making tough choices in health care. So we made a beginning with exchanges that are going into effect in 2014. I would like to go further. Republicans and Democrats, and I believe whoever gets elected governor, are going to pursue my waiver so that employers and employees will have more choice and more competition, and Oregon can lead the way. And I believe Oregon, with my waiver, will be the first state in the country to have a public option to take on the insurance companies.
You want to respond to that, Jim? You can rebut that if you have 30 seconds.
Well, as I look at your record, it's this. You said in 2007, here's a bill, choice and competition. In 2009, Christmas Eve, you voted for a bill that has no choice and competition in it. Now you want an exemption for Oregonians. If it's such a good bill, why exemptions for Oregonians or for anybody else? If it's good enough for the nation, it's good enough for Oregonians. It just seems to me you have been totally inconsistent on this, and it's very difficult to conclude anything else than that it's a total lack of political courage on your part to stand up to the administration and the leadership of your party.
Senator Wyden, your next question of Mr. Huffman.
Mr. Huffman, earlier this year here in Portland, you said that you were, quote, pro-choice. Then when you went over to the east side of Oregon, you described that Roe versus Wade was a mistake and it should be up to state and local governments whether to outlaw abortion. So the question, Mr. Huffman, is what is it? Is it the Portland position where you're pro-choice, or is it what you said on the east side that Roe was a mistake and that you would leave it up to states and local governments with respect to outlawing abortion?
Well, Ron, if you had taken my constitutional law class, I would have explained to you that you can be opposed to, you can be pro-choice and believe that Roe v. Wade is a bad decision. Indeed, I would wager that 90% of the law professors in this country, left and right, would tell you that, who teach constitutional law, would tell you that Roe v. Wade is a bad decision. I think it's a bad decision from a constitutional principle point of view. But that doesn't mean that I favor, that I'm opposed to a choice for women. I said that here, and I said it on the east side.
If you go to the United States Senate and you say something's unconstitutional, you're obligated to take action. And I'm particularly concerned that now that Mr. Huffman has raised reservations about the constitutionality of Roe versus Wade, if he were to go to the United States Senate, particularly with his position that he wants more conservative, activist judges on the bench, we would put women's rights in jeopardy. I support Roe versus Wade. I think the federal government ought to leave women alone. I'm going to do everything I can to discourage abortion. I support foster care, adoptions, all the other services, but a woman ought to have a right to choose.
Our last question of each other, and Mr. Huffman, we begin with you. Your question to Senator Wyden.
Well, Senator Wyden, you've received much praise from the various editorial boards who've endorsed you for your bipartisanship. And we all heard for many years about the great relationship you and Gordon Smith had. And yet, when Gordon Smith was running for re-election, you were prepared to throw him under the bus, throw that relationship away entirely for party unity, to do what your party wanted you to do. How do you explain that as a bipartisan member of the United States Senate?
We all understand that in elections, you go out and campaign, particularly today in Oregon, for those who are closest to your views. But when elections are over, and I feel this so passionately, you set aside the partisan labels and you try to find common ground. And to his credit, Gordon Smith agreed with that view. As you know, I won that low-key, quiet contest early in 1996. Then Senator Smith got elected to the United States Senate. We went a few blocks from here and we had a great breakfast. And we made some decisions, one of which was that we would be supporting the candidates of our party. We were the respective leaders. We knew we'd be called upon to do that. But when elections were over, we'd set everything aside. We did that. I was honored to serve with him, and we followed exactly what the two of us agreed on, and he's also supporting you, I note, in this campaign.
You can respond.
Well, my only response, if we don't want to talk about elections and we want to talk about what goes on in Congress, is it bipartisan to vote 97% of the time with your own party and leadership, which is what you've done in the current Congress.
Our final portion of this debate, 3-minute closing statements from each debater, and we're going to begin with Mr. Huffman. Jim, you have 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Portland City Club, for hosting this debate. I regret that Ron Wyden declined to have this debate, or yesterday's debate, earlier before the ballots dropped and people voted, but better late than never. As you have seen, Mr. Wyden and I have very different philosophies about government and very different approaches to getting us out of the horrible economic mess we are in. Everywhere I go over this state, I hear over and over from individuals and employers how frightened and uncertain they are about the future. They constantly tell me they are not investing in growth and in job creation because of the fear of more taxes, more regulation, and the uncertainty under current regulation. No amount of federal spending will remedy these problems. Last night and today, Senator Wyden has told us he wants to put Oregonians back to work. He wants to get the timber industry off of its back. My question is simply this. You've had 30 years in Congress, and in those 30 years, Oregon's unemployment has skyrocketed above the national average for the last 14 years, and our timber industry and thousands of jobs that come with it are dried up. Why should Oregonians give you 6 more years to do what you couldn't accomplish in the last 30? The truth is this. For 3 decades, Ron Wyden has voted for the steady expansion of the federal government and for more intrusion into the lives of Oregonians. Ron Wyden voted for $1 trillion in stimulus spending, which contributed to a $1.5 trillion deficit this year. He has voted for all the legislation and the raising of the debt limit that has brought us to a nearly $14 trillion federal debt. He provided the 60th vote for health care that he said he opposed, and now he wants an exemption for Oregonians from. If you like this kind of government, then I think Ron Wyden is your man. But if you believe, as I do, that more government spending, more taxes, and more burdensome regulations will not get our nation out of this recession, if you believe, as I do, that our children and grandchildren deserve a future of opportunity, a future where government respects them as free and responsible individuals, not wards of the state, if you believe, as I do, that the only way to economic prosperity and job creation is through private initiative, innovation, and investment, if you believe, as I do, that Congress should respect the opinions of the American people, and if you believe that we desperately need new leadership in Washington, then I think I am your man. Leslie and I and our friends, family, and supporters are in this to make a difference, not to make a living. I ask the same of you. Now is the most critical time in our lives because the future of our children and grandchildren is at stake. Thank you very much.
Senator Wyden.
When we began this debate, I talked about how I came to public service through my days of going to bat for Oregon's senior citizens. Back in those days, a lot of seniors would purchase private insurance policies that promised to fill the huge gaps in Medicare. They were sold by quick buck artists, fast-talking salesmen, and many of those policies weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Often I would meet with a senior citizen at their home, and midway through the discussion, the senior would go into another room, come out red-faced and embarrassed with a shoebox that was often filled with more than a dozen of these worthless health insurance policies. I decided to run for public office to end exactly this sort of outrage, and to make sure that every person received the respect and dignity they deserve. And when I was elected, I passed the bipartisan law to finally crack down on these rip-off policies that supplement Medicare. That law is still the model for consumer protection for the nation's elderly. That's the difference for this campaign. Here are some examples. I voted twice against the $700 billion Wall Street bailout. Mr. Huffman began criticizing me on the first day of this campaign for being one of the first in the Senate to stand in opposition to these obscene bailouts. I led a bipartisan effort to fight against the billions in taxpayer-funded bonuses for Wall Street. Mr. Huffman wrote articles defending the bonuses. Mr. Huffman wants to privatize portions of Social Security, risking everybody's retirement savings in the stock market. I oppose the privatization of Social Security. We didn't get to it today, but I was one of only 23 senators who voted against going to war in Iraq, a war so unwise, expensive, and unjustified that my former colleague, Senator Smith, called the decision almost criminal and said he wished he had never voted for it. Mr. Huffman defends the decision to go to war in Iraq at the cost of far too many lives and more than $2 trillion added to the national debt. And while I was bringing together timber companies and conservationists, achieving the first major forest compromise in Oregon in 30 years, Mr. Huffman devoted time and resources to tearing the effort down, including last night making it up that the American Forest Resources Council, the premier timber group, opposed our efforts. Folks, this seat in the United States Senate belongs to you, to all of you, the people of Oregon. If you honor me with your vote, no one is going to work harder to bring people together and find the solutions that work for our state. Thank you, and God bless all the people of Oregon.
That wraps up our forum. Let's give our candidates a round of applause for taking part this afternoon as our president takes the stage. Thank you very much.
I want to thank our Truth Squad members, Brianne Arnold, Joyce DeMonin, and Jean Hart. Thank you also to our timekeeper, Tony Yacarino. A special thank you to our moderator, Jeff Gianola. And of course, our greatest appreciation to today's guests, Ron Wyden and Jim Huffman. Thank you again. Please join us again next week for a forum with U.S. Attorney Dwight Holton. We are adjourned.